Judge Samuel Harris had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades, and his reputation as a stern but fair judge was well established in the small city's legal community. That morning, as he adjusted his glasses and reviewed his docket, he braced himself for what he expected to be a routine day. The courtroom was bustling with lawyers, clerks, and a few families scattered among the benches. A few minor traffic violations, a couple of civil disputes, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, Angela Wright's name was called. The room quieted as she stepped forward. She was tall, with a composed demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to handling herself in high-pressure situations. Her sharp suit, tailored perfectly, was understated but clearly expensive, her heels clicking decisively as she made her way to the defendant's table. It was a look of confidence, the kind often worn by professionals accustomed to navigating complex challenges, but there was no sense of arrogance about her. Angela glanced up briefly, her eyes meeting Judge Harris as he settled into his seat. It was a calm exchange, one that many would describe as polite, but there was something almost imperceptible in her gaze, a coolness that hinted at a woman who was used to power and responsibility. Harris didn't pay much attention to this, though. He simply saw what he had assumed to be another straightforward case. The court clerk quickly outlined the issue at hand. Angela was accused of not renewing a business permit on time. A minor error, certainly, but one that required attention according to city regulations. The fine, if imposed, would be significant enough to warrant a brief hearing, but wouldn't cause lasting harm. It was the kind of case Harris had handled countless times before. Angela remained calm, speaking with clarity and precision as she explained the circumstances. There had been a clerical oversight on the part of her staff, she said, a delay that had caused her to miss the renewal deadline. She didn't deny the oversight, but she made it clear that her business was in good standing otherwise. In fact, she mentioned, her business provided valuable services to the community, though she did not elaborate further. Harris, feeling the case was clear-cut, listened but remained detached. He had heard similar defenses countless times before, and he wasn't moved. "I find no reason to dismiss the fine," Judge Harris stated, his voice firm. "You've admitted to the oversight, and the law is clear. I'm imposing a fine of $2,500, which must be paid by the end of the month. Court is adjourned." Angela nodded, accepting the ruling without protest, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that made the judge pause for a moment. Yet he quickly dismissed any thought of lingering. He had cases to handle, and Angela was just another defendant in the long line of cases for the day. As Angela left the courtroom, her step was measured, purposeful. Judge Harris moved on, confident in his decision, unaware that this seemingly simple case was about to reveal something that would change the way he viewed the world around him. Angela Wright's life was anything but ordinary. To the casual observer, she was a composed businesswoman, perhaps a little out of place in a courtroom full of everyday citizens. But there was far more beneath the surface. Angela wasn't just another executive. She had carved out a path to the very highest echelons of power within the federal government. As the head of federal government operations, she oversaw national programs that influenced everything from infrastructure to emergency management. Her role was crucial to the functioning of the country, but very few outside of Washington, D.C., knew her name. Born in a small working-class neighborhood, Angela had always been driven. She knew early on that her success would not come easily. Raised by a single mother who worked tirelessly as a teacher, Angela was taught the value of hard work, integrity, and a quiet strength that would guide her through her career. She excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she studied political science and public administration. From there, she entered the world of local government, quickly making a name for herself with her sharp mind and unflinching work ethic. By the time Angela was in her early 30s, she had already made significant strides in the public sector. Her ability to navigate complex bureaucracies, solve problems, and negotiate high-stakes deals caught the attention of those in power. Slowly but surely, she began climbing the ranks, each step a testament to her unparalleled skills and determination. By her 40s, Angela had risen to a position that few could imagine, leading federal government operations, where she oversaw the logistics and administration that kept the country running, especially in times of crisis. Despite her influence, Angela had always kept a low profile. She wasn't one for public attention or accolades. While some politicians sought the spotlight, Angela found satisfaction in working behind the scenes, making decisions that affected millions without ever seeking recognition. She had built a reputation not through media appearances or public speeches, but through results, successful initiatives, efficient government programs, and a steady hand in some of the most critical moments of national governance. Angela had never intended for her life to be a headline. She didn't seek fame, nor did she care for the trappings of power. What mattered to her was the work, the millions of people she helped, the systems she streamlined, the communities she supported. Yet her quiet leadership did not go unnoticed. She had become a force to be reckoned with, even if she preferred to stay in the background, far from the public eye. And so, when Angela entered that courtroom to face the fine, she wasn't just the woman standing before Judge Harris. She was someone who had spent years building a legacy of influence and leadership. But none of that mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the case at hand, or so it seemed. Angela Wright had never been one for unnecessary confrontation. Throughout her career, she had learned that there were always ways to resolve issues without drawing attention or causing unnecessary drama. But this time was different. The minor mistake with the business permit was a bureaucratic misstep, something that could have been handled behind closed doors. She had tried to resolve it with the local authorities, sending multiple emails, making phone calls, and even meeting with the city clerk. Yet, despite her best efforts, nothing had been done to rectify the situation. The issue lingered, and now, a fine loomed. It wasn't the money that bothered her. $2,500 wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, especially for someone in her position. What frustrated her was the principle of the matter. Angela had spent her career working in government, pushing for efficiency and fairness. She understood the importance of rules, but she also knew that rules should be applied with a sense of balance, not rigidly or out of spite. The local authorities seemed more interested in following procedure than addressing the larger context of the situation. This wasn't just a case of a mistake. It was an example of a system that failed to recognize the nuances of human error. So, despite the triviality of the case, Angela knew she had to see it through. She wasn't one to let things slide, especially when they involved principles she held dear. If anything, attending the hearing was a statement, one that she hoped would bring attention to the need for more nuanced governance at every level, from the local to the national. She wasn't sure how much of an impact it would have, but she understood that sometimes making a point in public could spark change. On the morning of the hearing, Angela dressed carefully. She didn't want to look like she was overdoing it, but she also wanted to project the authority and professionalism that had guided her throughout her career. Her black tailored suit, simple but elegant, fit the occasion perfectly. She had opted for minimal jewelry, choosing instead a pair of understated pearl earrings and a watch. The outfit was a subtle message in itself, a woman of power who wasn't interested in drama, but who demanded respect in whatever room she entered. As she walked into the courtroom, a few heads turned. Some of the clerks and staff whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of her. She didn't look like the average defendant. No one ever did, not really, but there was something about her calm composure that stood out. Her face was unreadable, though her eyes carried a sharpness that suggested she was anything but ordinary. There was a certain quiet power in the way she moved through the room, and a few onlookers couldn't help but wonder who she was. Judge Harris barely looked up as she approached the bench. To him, she was just another person, someone with a routine case, in a routine courtroom. But he would soon learn that nothing about Angela Wright was routine. Judge Samuel Harris glanced down at the case file in front of him. The name Angela Wright had been noted as the defendant, but beyond the business permit issue, there wasn't much that stood out. In his experience, these kinds of cases were common, nothing more than a procedural matter that needed to be cleared up. He was accustomed to cases involving small fines, people who made simple errors in paperwork or missed a deadline. In fact, this case wasn't much different from the others. Angela had explained her situation calmly, outlining the clerical error that led to the missed renewal deadline. She didn't try to shift the blame or make excuses. Judge Harris appreciated that. It was always easier to deal with people who owned up to their mistakes. But to him, it didn't change the fact that the rules were clear. A deadline was missed, and a fine was the consequence. He didn't need to hear more to make his decision. "Ms. Wright," Judge Harris began, his voice steady, "you've admitted to the mistake, and while I understand that it was not intentional, the law is clear. You are still required to meet the regulatory deadlines. Therefore, I'm imposing a fine of $2,500, which must be paid within 30 days. Angela nodded, her expression unchanged. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She didn't seem frustrated or angry. In fact, her demeanor was so composed that Judge Harris almost felt as though she was indifferent to the outcome. She stood up, straightening her jacket and gathering her papers, without a word of protest. It was a quiet acceptance, but there was an underlying strength in it. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said with a brief nod, her voice even and polite, yet there was an unspoken finality in her tone. As she turned to leave, Judge Harris watched her walk out of the courtroom with measured steps. There was something about the way she carried herself that lingered in the back of his mind. The courtroom, filled with the usual mix of tense anticipation and the shuffle of paperwork, suddenly felt less ordinary. It wasn't that Angela had done anything out of the ordinary, really. She had simply accepted the fine and moved on. But there was something about her, something about the ease with which she navigated the process, that made the moment stick with him. He had met countless people in his time as a judge, but Angela Wright stood apart. She had the kind of presence that could command attention without raising her voice or demanding it. Perhaps it was the way she walked, the way she held herself, or the aura of calm authority that surrounded her. Whatever it was, Judge Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than just the fine. As he turned his attention to the next case on the docket, he pushed the thought aside. There was work to be done. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small seed of curiosity was planted. Later that evening, Judge Harris sat alone in his chambers, reviewing his notes from the day's proceedings. The courtroom had emptied out hours ago, and the day's cases were largely forgotten in the rush of more pressing matters. But Angela Wright's case lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't the fine itself that troubled him. After all, it was a minor error with clear consequences. What had stuck with him was the way Angela had carried herself, composed, quiet, and almost impervious to the process. There was something about her that felt out of place in that courtroom. Just as he was about to move on to his next set of cases, his clerk, Amanda, knocked softly and entered with a small stack of papers. "Judge, there's something you might want to see," she said, handing him a file with Angela Wright's name on it. Harris looked at her in mild confusion. He hadn't requested anything further on the case. Amanda noticed the question in his eyes and quickly explained, "I did a little digging after the hearing. You mentioned her name sounded familiar earlier, and I thought you'd like to know more." Harris frowned. "What do you mean?" Amanda hesitated, unsure of how to present the information. Finally, she spoke. "Angela Wright. She's not just a business owner. She's the head of federal government operations, one of the most influential people in the country. I thought you might want to know." Judge Harris stared at her for a long moment, the pieces slowly falling into place. He had dismissed Angela so quickly, assuming she was just another defendant. But now, the entire situation felt different. His pulse quickened. Asterisk the head of federal government operations asterisk. He thought back to her calm demeanor in the courtroom, the quiet authority she had exuded, and the way she had handled the case as though it were beneath her. It wasn't arrogance, but something else entirely, a quiet power that he had completely overlooked. He flipped through the papers in the file Amanda had brought him. There were official documents outlining Angela Wright's career and the vast array of responsibilities she held in the government. Her work influenced policy decisions, oversaw national security protocols, and managed federal responses in crisis. She had helped steer major initiatives on a national scale, and yet she had stood before him in his courtroom that morning, as if she were just another citizen. Judge Harris felt a wave of realization wash over him, a combination of awe and embarrassment. He had imposed a fine on one of the most powerful figures in the country without the slightest clue of her identity. Worse, he had done so without considering the broader implications of his decision. He hadn't even paused to wonder why such a person would be in a courtroom over something so trivial as a permit renewal. His mind raced as he grappled with the gravity of his oversight. What had he missed? What had he failed to see? His hands hovered over the case file, torn between wanting to make things right and the gnawing sense that his judgment had been hasty, prejudiced, even without him realizing it. "Get me her office," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I need to speak with her." The phone call to Angela Wright's office was made with an uneasy sense of urgency. Judge Harris had spent the better part of the evening digesting the information he had received about her. He had been both shocked and humbled by the revelation of her true identity. He couldn't help but feel a sense of embarrassment. The woman he had casually found in his courtroom was not only highly influential, but she was also at the very heart of the nation's government operations. As the phone rang, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. What was he going to say? What could he possibly say that would rectify his oversight? He had no answers, but the only thing he knew for sure was that he had to make things right. His actions in court had been rash, and now he needed to offer an apology, not just for the fine, but for the presumption with which he had approached the case. The call was answered by a polite voice on the other end. "Good evening, Judge Harris. How may I assist you?" "I need to speak with Ms. Wright," he said, trying to sound calm despite the nerves creeping into his voice. "It's a matter of some urgency. Please tell her it's regarding the case that was heard in court earlier today." There was a brief pause, and then the voice responded, "I'll see if she's available. Please hold for just a moment." Judge Harris sat back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the desk as the seconds ticked by. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that this was just a conversation, just an apology. But he knew it would be more than that. This wasn't simply a procedural issue. It was about respecting authority, understanding his own blind spots, and most importantly, confronting the unconscious biases that had clouded his judgment. After a few moments, the voice returned. "Judge Harris, Ms. Wright is available to speak with you now. I'll transfer you." The line clicked, and Angela's calm, measured voice filled the air. "Judge Harris," she said, "how can I help you?" "Ms. Wright," he began, his tone sincere, "I'm calling to apologize for my actions earlier today. I handled your case rashly, and I regret it. I didn't take the time to understand the full context of your situation, and in doing so, I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made. I owe you an apology." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Judge Harris wondered if she was simply going to hang up. But then Angela spoke, her voice still calm, but now laced with something that sounded like understanding. "I appreciate your call, Judge Harris," she said, "and I respect that you're willing to own your mistake. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not interested in making a spectacle out of this. I didn't seek this fine, and I don't need a public apology. I just wanted to settle the matter. What matters to me is that we approach our work with fairness and understanding, and that we always look beyond the surface." Her words struck him deeply. It wasn't about public recognition or getting credit for doing the right thing. It was about integrity, humility, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Values that Angela had clearly lived by in her career, and that Judge Harris now realized he had to reassess in his own. "I understand," he said quietly. "I truly do. If there's anything else I can do to make amends, please don't hesitate to let me know." Angela's response was simple but pointed. "Judge, the best way to make amends is to remember this lesson in the future. Don't make assumptions, especially about people you don't know. And if you're ever in doubt, remember that people often have far more to offer than you might see at first glance. She didn't wait for a response. The line went silent, and Angela Wright had already moved on. But Judge Harris sat there, holding the receiver in his hand, reflecting on the lesson he had just learned. The phone call with Angela Wright had left Judge Harris deep in thought. He sat at his desk long after the call had ended, turning over her words in his mind. Don't make assumptions, especially about people you don't know. She had said it calmly, but there was a quiet force in the message that stuck with him. For the first time in a long while, Harris realized just how often he had relied on quick judgments based on superficial impressions. How many times had he made snap decisions, confident in his experience, only to miss the deeper story unfolding before him? That evening, as he reviewed his calendar and case files, Harris found himself asking a different question. Why had he assumed that Angela Wright was just another businesswoman caught in a bureaucratic snafu? What had made him think that someone with her presence in the courtroom could simply be reduced to an average defendant? He had let the uniform of her appearance, the suit, the composed manner, blind him to the fact that she was not ordinary, not by a long shot. She was someone who operated at the highest levels of government, and yet he had treated her as if she were just another person standing before him. It was humbling, and humbling in a way he hadn't experienced before. The more he thought about the conversation, the more Harris realized that he had learned something invaluable, not just about Angela, but about himself. He had been so focused on the letter of the law, on its rigid application, that he had neglected the human element. He hadn't taken a moment to consider who she might be, what experiences she might have had, and how those experiences shaped her actions and presence. The conversation had challenged his view of the justice system, not just in terms of fairness, but in terms of understanding the context and stories behind the cases that came before him. Angela had not asked for an apology. She had not demanded anything from him. Instead, she had offered him a perspective, one that he hadn't considered before. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about recognizing the complexities of people and situations, about approaching each case with openness and awareness. He realized now that he had to approach the law with not just an eye for fairness, but with an ear for understanding. The next day, Harris walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. He had decided that he would change how he interacted with those who appeared before him. It wasn't enough to simply deliver a ruling. It was about listening, observing, and trying to see the bigger picture. He was determined to make better decisions, to stop rushing to conclusions, and take the time to truly understand the people whose lives were impacted by the law. As he sat at the bench, waiting for the first case of the day, Harris couldn't help but think of Angela Wright again. She had left an impression on him that would last, not because of her position, but because of her wisdom and grace. Her example had set a new standard for him. If he could approach every case with the same thoughtfulness she had shown, perhaps he could truly become the kind of judge he had always aspired to be, a judge who saw beyond the surface and embraced the complexity of the people who came before him. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he realized that perhaps his encounter with Angela Wright wasn't just a chance meeting in a courtroom. It was a pivotal moment, one that had forever altered his perspective on the justice he was meant to uphold. The days following his conversation with Angela Wright were transformative for Judge Samuel Harris. He found himself reflecting on every case, every ruling, with a new lens, a lens shaped by his conversation with a woman who had once seemed so ordinary and yet had turned out to be extraordinary in every sense. He had learned more in those few minutes on the phone than he had in months of reviewing case files and hearing arguments. For the first time in a long time, Harris understood that the law wasn't just a set of rules to be applied with cold efficiency. It was a living, breathing system shaped by the people it governed. As the weeks went on, Judge Harris began to change the way he interacted with those who came before him. He became more attentive, more open, more thoughtful. No longer did he rush to conclusions based solely on appearances or a quick glance at the case file. He took time to listen, to really listen, and to ask questions that went beyond the surface. He was no longer content to simply hand down rulings. Instead, he sought to understand the human element behind every case, every decision. Whether it was a small misdemeanor or a complicated civil dispute, Harris approached each one with renewed care and attention, realizing that he was not just delivering justice, but shaping it with every choice he made. His colleagues noticed the change. There were murmurs in the courthouse about how Harris had become more approachable, more empathetic. His rulings had always been fair, but now they carried a weight of understanding that had been lacking before. Lawyers began to comment on how much easier it was to work with him. Litigants, too, felt a shift. There was a newfound respect in the way he interacted with people. No longer did he look at them as simple case numbers. Now he saw them as individuals, each with a story, each deserving of consideration. And then, one day, Angela Wright reappeared in the courthouse. It wasn't for anything personal. She was there as part of a larger initiative, leading a panel on government accountability and transparency, speaking to a room full of public servants. Harris had heard about it and decided to attend, not as a judge, but as a member of the public, to hear her insights. When Angela spoke, it was with the same calm authority she had exhibited in their phone call. But now it was clear that her wisdom extended far beyond the world of government operations. She spoke of integrity, leadership, and the importance of seeing the bigger picture when making decisions that affect people's lives. It was a message that resonated deeply with Harris. He listened closely, fully aware of how much he had learned from her in such a short time. After the panel, Angela caught sight of Harris in the back of the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was a silent acknowledgement between them, a quiet understanding that they had both learned something valuable from their brief encounter, a reminder that life and the justice system was about more than just rules. It was about fairness, perspective, and the humility to recognize when you had been wrong. Angela offered a brief smile before turning to speak to someone else, and Harris, standing there, felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned the most important lesson of all. That true leadership in law and in life was about understanding others, respecting them, and never assuming that you knew their story before hearing it. As Harris walked out of the courthouse that day, a sense of peace settled over him. He knew that, from that point forward, he would approach every case, every person, with a deeper sense of empathy. Angela Wright had not only changed the way he judged others, but had also reminded him of the power of seeing people for who they truly were, not just as defendants, but as human beings. And for that, he would always be grateful.